much for this kind introduction. Let's see if we can get the computer going here. Meine Damen und Herren, guten Abend.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening.
Intelligente Maschinen ist der Titel meines Vortrages heute Abend.
Intelligent machines is the title of my lecture tonight.
Es gibt zwei Arten von intelligenten Maschinen, die biologischen und die künstlichen.
There are two types of intelligent machines that are biological and artificial.
Benvenuti a tutti gli italiani nella stanza.
Welcome to all Italians in the Hope.
Spero che si goda la mia presentazione stasera.
I hope you enjoy my presentation tonight.
Now don't worry, I'm not going to speak in Chinese, but it can translate English to Chinese as well.
不用担心我不会用中文说话，但是你也可以将英语翻译成
Now, the reason why I started with this is because the change to voice interfaces, I think, will be the most important change in computer science and the most important change in the way we interact with computers over the next few years. And it is that change to a voice interface that needed voice recognition, and as you saw, the voice recognition, even with my poor German and Italian, was pretty good. It translated it most of the time, acceptably well. And then it also synthesized the speech in the other language in an acceptable manner. And that's really what I mean by intelligent machines. And this is the title of my talk. And it's really about evolution versus design. So let us look at the contents of the way I have structured the talk. On the biological side, we've got building blocks like the neurons, which are the basic building blocks of intelligence. On the artificial machine side, we've got transistors. When we're talking about thinking, of course, we mean thinking with the brain, which is quite a large collection of neurons, about 100 billion. And if we talk about artificial machines, and they think, and machine learning and artificial intelligence, it is about computers. But one of the great changes that are about to happen is that these computers will have a much better connectivity with the real world. We, of course, have had ears for a long time as biological machines, but computers now have microphones that are getting pretty good, so we will compare those two. Then we'll do the same thing for seeing, and again, our eyes we're all very familiar with, but what cameras now can do may surprise you. Then we come on to moving. One of the quintessential properties of man is that we can move about with a couple of legs. Well, let us see what robots can do, because they might have legs that might surprise you. The most dramatic improvement in machine intelligence has really been the development of machine learning. We learn at school, it takes us a long time. Some people now talk about lifelong learning, quite correctly so. But it is machine learning which really enjoys its time in the sun at the moment, in particular convolutional neural networks. But this dramatic development of intelligent capabilities of machines is leading to really quite dramatic disruptions in a number of sectors of our society. In particular, in cars, where we will see two such fundamental disruptions, the electrification, which I believe will be the minor disruption, big as it is, but autonomous driving will be the one that provides a complete restructuring of the value stack in the car industry, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And I will then finish up with maybe some philosophical thoughts almost on evolution versus design. So let us start with the basic building blocks of those two types of machines, the biological ones and the artificial ones. The neurons, of course, are the building block of brains, the transistors, the building blocks of computers. How do they compare? Well, neurons are about 20 microns in size, but transistors are now down to the 20 nanometer level. That's 1,000 times smaller. The speed of neurons is comparatively slow, about 1 kilohertz. Most computers nowadays tick along at a much faster clip at 1 gigahertz. That's 1 million times faster than our neurons. However, when it comes to the number of neurons in the brain, we still have a 10 times advantage of even the largest chips the semiconductor industry can produce at the moment. We have about 100 billion neurons in our brain, and there are only about 10 billion transistors on the largest chips that we can produce right now. The real difference, though, and the most exciting difference, and the difference that we understand the least, is the 100 trillion connections in the brain. So a neuron has an average of 1,000 to 10,000 connections, and it is that connectivity which keeps our intelligence still just about ahead of machine intelligence. There are some developments that are sort of comparable with, 1 billion hosts on the internet and 20 or 50 billion Internet of Things that are expected in the next few years. But 100 trillion is still a number very much larger than that. So let's look in a little more detail at the building blocks of the brain and the computer. So here is a typical neuron. And as you see, it's really very, very complex. On the left here, you've got the dendrites, which are the parts of the neuron that collect all the information from other neurons. And there are about 1,000 to 10,000 of these connections that come in through the other neurons. Then there is the cell body itself, and because a neuron is a cell that is alive, of course it has all the paraphernalia of a cell. It has a cell nucleus, it has the mitochondria, it has the ribosomes, so it has all the machinery of a cell to keep the neuron alive. And then when it's collected all these inputs from the dendrites, it sums them all up, and if it's above a certain threshold, it fires. And it fires down one axon that it has, and this one axon can be quite long. The longest one is from the bottom of our spine to the big toe, so it's over 1 meter long, and these neurons are only 20 nanometers big, so it's really quite an amazing stretch. And when they are long like that, they have these myelin sheaths to speed up the spike that travels down the neuron. When it comes to the end of it, there are these external terminals to spread out the signal, again up to 1,000 other neurons, through synapses. And these synapses are the ends of the axons, and they have these neurotransmitters in them that they disgorge into the synaptic cleft, hoping that some of them will get across to the receptors and then cause the inputs to another neuron. As you see, the story is really a very complex story with lots of different parts to the neuron, lots of different ways of influencing the neurons, lots of different ways of putting weights on these signals that come in, because if they're further away, they will influence the threshold a little less, and so on. So there's the soma, the cell body, there are these dendrites, there are the axon with myelin sheaths, there are synapses, And Cambridge, of course, has made one of the most important discoveries and contributions to understanding neurons with the voltage-gated ion channels from the now called the Hodgkin-Huxley model. And this is it in mathematical form. Here you've got the input from, say, 1,000 neurons. They all get weighted. They all have different weights. And then they all get summed up. And if the sum of them all exceeds a certain threshold, it goes bang. And it really does go bang. This is an interesting fact that our brains actually are digital in the sense that when it goes bang, we send out these spikes. And all the spikes are always the same. They're about a millisecond long. They're about 100 millivolts high. And the only thing that changes, and here is a trace of them, is how many of them are being sent out per second. Here you see the neuron got very excited and sent out lots of spikes. And here it's more quiet and sends out a spike every now and then. Now, what a contrast with a transistor. A transistor is an incredibly simple beast. It just consists of three pieces. The source of the electrons, so this is where the electrons come in. A gate, which is basically the switch. The gate decides on whether to let the electrons through or not. And when it lets the electron through, they get collected by a drain and come out the other side. So it's just a switch that changes the flow of electrons through this conductor here, and it's either on or off for most of the digital applications that we have. So let's look at the transistor. Very simple, really. Three pieces, a source, a gate, and the drain. Very simple, very uniform. Most of the transistors on a wafer, and there might be billions of them, are the same. And amazingly, there is a universal building block for computers. It's called a NAND gate, a not AND gate. And this is it. This is the symbol of it. And it basically says if A is true and B is true, then the output is 0. Now, this has found a very seductive analogy in Aristotle's syllogism. Because if all men are mortal, and Socrates is a man, then Socrates is mortal. And the simple mapping of the syllogism onto a NAND gate has seduced us into thinking that we can solve we can model most of the things that happen in the world in this digital manner. And we were mistaken. But this is what we did in the early days of computing until quite recently. We believed in this idea of dividing the world into things that are true and things that are false, on ones and zeros, on 5 volts or zeros, and exclude the middle. We thought that this was a smart thing to do, and indeed it was. It worked extremely well, because you can approach or you can simulate quite complex analog functions like this sine wave here by splitting it up into digital steps. And if you want to be more accurate, well, you just use more digits. And you can keep doing that until in the digitization of sound, for example, on a CD, you can't hear the difference. You really perceive a very smooth analog signal. But when it comes to thinking, we've got to look at the units that do the thinking. And of course, on the left, we've got the brain. We believe that most of the thinking goes on in the brain, or some people believe that this is not necessarily so. And most of the thinking, or the densest and fastest computing element that we have is a GPU, a so-called graphical processing unit. Here we've got one from NVIDIA that is thinking faster and more per second than any other unit. And here on the internet, and this amazed me when I did the research, I found a package that has that contains memory of 512 gigabytes. That's half a terabyte in this small package, which is about 2 centimeters by 2 centimeters by 1.5 millimeters, and it weighs a gram. I mean, it is just the most amazing achievement in the semiconductor industry. So let's compare the brain with the semiconductor industry. The brain, and it's very difficult to make these estimates about the brain. Lots of people have tried, and that's why you've got to accept that even this guess at between 10 and 100 terabytes might be out by a factor of 10 or so, but these are the best estimates that I've found. However, the package that I just showed you, that was 100 gigabytes, you just need 1,000 of those, since that package weighed a gram and a brain weighs a kilogram. The equivalent of the brain would be 1,000 of those. So a kilogram of these packages that you saw on the previous slide would be 500 terabytes, which is 5 times what people believe a brain can store. So for the first time in history, really, we now have a computer memory that is larger than the memory in the brain. However, now it comes to processing power. These are, again, estimates that vary wildly, but it's somewhere between 10 peta and 1 exaflop. I'm sure you're all familiar with the expressions. Now, peta is actually a corruption of penta, and it's 10 to the 15. Exa is a corruption of hexa, and is 10 to the 18, and flops are floating point operations per second. So this is an amazing processing power, and actually still 1,000 times better than the best computers that we have right now. This is totally, totally amazing. However, not as amazing as the next figure, which is we're doing all that with a power consumption of 20 watts. Otherwise, our brains would burn out. Now, if you did the equivalent calculation for putting enough of these processors together to give you the same petaflops of processing power that the brain produces, you end up with 200 kilowatts. Now, that's 10,000 times what our brain consumes. So this is really the most staggering difference between the brains and computers, except for one more, and that's the 100 trillion connections, of course, that we talked about earlier on. So now we've got this difference between brains, and this is a picture of a brain with all these connections in the cortex here. And what characterizes a brain? Well, it's massively parallel, because all these things happen at the same time. It has a distributed memory, so it does both the calculation and the memory at the same time in different places of the brain, and it has sparse connectivity. On the right, interestingly, we have new computer architectures, sometimes called neuromorphic computing, because the computer architects have copied some of the ideas that they found by studying the brain. And interestingly, these new architectures are also massively parallel. They also have a distributed memory and sparse connectivity. And the picture that you see here is a picture produced by GraphCore, a company I'll talk to you about in a little while. And again, it shows the groupings of these processors and how they connect locally with this bunch of processors, and how they might connect across to another bunch of processors. So it's all about connectivity and how they work with each other. So here is an interesting project called the Human Connectome project, where people took MRI pictures of the connection of 200 different parts of the brain and how they talk to each other. This is an MRI picture that was taken in Oxford, a perfectly acceptable university that does some good research. And it was done on 461 people, and it produced that beautiful picture. And here is this picture again that isn't too unlike the picture that we've seen before of the intelligent processing unit. At the moment, all computers have two types of processors. They have the CPU, the central processing unit, which might be an old-fashioned type from Intel, or you might have one of the modern microprocessors from ARM that is the CPU that's at the center of all the computers. But in addition to that, you also have a GPU, a graphical processing unit, which deals with all the video. We now believe that it will be necessary to have a third type of processor, which we call the IPU, the Intelligent Processing Unit, to deal with a completely different problem that is very characteristic of machine learning. And it is very different from all the other processing jobs that have gone before. And the characteristic of an intelligent processing unit is the very large number of processors. Now, we've been trying to use parallel computing for a very long time, and this turns out to be very difficult, and there is no generic solution for parallel processing. However, when it comes to machine learning, which is this exciting new problem that we're trying to solve, there is a natural way, normally, of parallelizing machine learning problems, and the IPUs specializes on this problem with lots of processors, but also lots of RAM on chip, so much so that this is likely to be the largest chip in the world, about 1 inch size, so a chip of this side. And the basic breakthrough idea here is an idea called the bulk synchronization protocol, where you separate the compute part of a job from the communications part. There is a second sort of neuromorphic project that is well worth reporting on, and that's the SpiNNaker project by Professor Steve Ferber, one of the two people who architected the ARM that has now become the most successful microprocessor in the world. And Stephen is using 1 million ARMs to simulate 1 billion neurons. I mean, it's only 1% of the brain, but you've got to start somewhere. But it does it in real time. And it does it at the spiking level. That's why it's called SpiNNaker. And the exciting thing is that most people believe that all the information that travels through the brain can be understood at the spiking level, so you don't have to go down to the detailed ion channel equations, etc. So if you just stick with the spikes, we will be able to simulate what actually goes on in the brain. And it's part of the flagship project, a European flagship project called the Human Brain Project. So let's look at hearing, at how these intelligent entities connect with the real world. Now, in the case of the biological world, of course, we have the ear to do this with, and computers use microphones, so how do they compare? Well, surprisingly well. Microphones actually don't do a lot better than we are, because they basically were designed to simulate the ear, so it's got a frequency range of 20 to 20 kilohertz. When it comes to perceiving very soft sounds, humans, especially if they're young, are very, very good. They can perceive sort of 0 dB, which is almost the definition of hearing something. And microphones are actually not quite as good as our own ears. But the second thing that turned out to be a key issue is sound localization. We can localize where the sound comes from to about 5 degrees. And that is quite important, because if you can do that in a computer, you can make speech recognition work across a room. And what I've put here on center stage is a product from Amazon called Echo that has beamforming microphones in it. And these beamforming microphones allow a computer to home in on your voice and cut out all the noise that's around you. The software in this box actually is Cambridge software from a company called Evie that was sold to Amazon some time ago. I've been supporting Evie and William Tunstall Peter, who was the genius behind the software, which I will demonstrate in a moment. The hardware, the best hardware for beamforming microphones, also comes from a British company in Bristol called Xmos. And as I said, it allows you to understand what people say across a busy room, because you home in on where the sound comes from, and without thinking about this, we do this very well. We then cut out all the other noise that happens around ourselves, and we just home in on the sound of the person that we want to talk to. And the echo can do the same thing. And if it performs for me, I'll try to demonstrate this to you now. Alexa, what is the weather going to be like in Cambridge tomorrow?
Tomorrow in Cambridge, United Kingdom, there will be clouds with a chance of showers, with a high of 16 and a low of 7.
Alexa, who is going to win the British elections?
Sorry, I couldn't find weather for the location I heard.
Alexa, who is going to win the British elections? Well, it's not performing for me at the moment, but we'll come back to that because it does have a bit of a sense of humor. So let's look at how we see. Of course, we see with our eyes, computers see with cameras, and how do they compare? Well, if you look at the resolution of the eye, it is very impressive. We can see, with the naked eye, you can see something of the size of 0.1 of a millimeter, which is remarkable. However, if you compare that with an electron microscope, for example, it's 1,000,000 times better. So really, the microscopes, of course, win hands down. This is even more dramatic when it comes to speed. We now have cameras that can resolve picoseconds. Again, a unit that most of you will be very familiar with. It's 10 to the minus 12 seconds. Now, 10 to the minus 12 seconds is such a short interval that light only travels 1/3 of a millimeter in a picosecond. So there are these amazing pictures at MIT. This is an MIT camera, where you can see a light front traveling across a scene, and because it's such a short light pulse, you can actually see it lighting up parts of the scenery as it travels across. So the time resolution of cameras is now 10 to the 10 times better than our resolution of the eye. So a remarkable difference in favor of intelligent machines. When it comes to frequency, we can see between 430 and 770 terahertz. That's 10 to the 12. But of course, again, cameras, especially if you include radar, have a much wider window. All this pales into insignificance with respect to the last point. We only have 2 eyes. Now, we are doing very well with our 2 eyes. We've got stereoscopic vision, etc. But many of us would like to have eyes at the back of our head as well, and that we don't have. Now, as we will see, autonomous driving cars, of course, will have cameras at the front, cameras at the back, cameras at the side, long cameras, short cameras, as we'll see in a moment. And there are 100,000 web cameras on the internet. So the availability of cameras all over the world will give such an advantage to intelligent machines that isn't really accessible to us to the same extent. So the many cameras is really the main difference between us and intelligent machines. As I said, there are 100,000 webcams, and there are autonomous vehicles need a lot. This is a typical example of an autonomous vehicle. It's an Uber car. It's got 6 cameras here, 2 cameras here, 2 cameras here, one radar system here, a LiDAR system. And it really is remarkable how you use all these different input devices, all these different eyes, and this is what a typical autonomous car looks like. So as you can see, it has long-range radar for cruise control that looks furthest away to see if there are any cars in front of it. Then there is LiDAR, the light equivalent of radar for emergency braking, pedestrian detection, collision avoidance. Then come the cameras to read the traffic signs, to do the lane detection. Then comes the short-range radar system for the cross-traffic alert. And then, as you get very close, especially from parking, you've got ultrasonic devices, so you know exactly how far you are from the car in front. Then you have cameras that look out the side, which would be nice to do if we had eyes on the side. And then there is this blind spot, which gets detected by another radar system. Ultrasonics, again, at the back, because you don't want to bump into the car in the back when you park your car. Rear collision warning, and then park assistance around view at the back. So you see, it's a very complex story and quite a large number of eyes in that car. And one of the key problems of machine intelligence is this problem and opportunity to fuse, as the jargon goes, to fuse all this information into one database that then allows you to make the best decision. And that, of course, is the reason why it is very highly likely that autonomous cars will be much safer than humans. Now, let's have a look at one of these self-driving cars. So what we see here is we're in a Tesla car. This camera here just is the view out of the car. The middle video processor is the thing that is the camera that looks straight ahead. So here you've got a car. When the car is green, then it shows that it's in the way and you might bump into it. So you need to pay special attention to the ones in green. The ones in blue, if you continue like that, you'll avoid, so they're not so important. This is the left rear view, this is the left right view, and we're just coming out of a parking garage. So we're turning left here. And as you can see, we've just seen a van here. And the program, which is the video camera, is not just recording the video stream, but it's actually interpreting the video stream. It decides this is a car, because it puts a green rectangle around it, and this car is in my way, so I better avoid it, otherwise I'll bump into it. So we come to a crossing, we turn left, we'll see all these blue cars on the left which don't bother us, but we've got some car coming in from the left, I think. Here we go, and now it does bother us because it's a green one that we might bump into. These purple ones on the right are road signs, so it also recognizes as road signs, of course, and will soon come to a traffic light. Here it is. And that's very important too. So it recognizes this traffic light, as it should, because if the traffic light is red, we better stop. It isn't, it's green, so we drive through it. And we turn left, cutting off this car because we're in a hurry. And again, it recognizes the traffic lights here and follows this way, and so on. So you see that we've come a long way in understanding what happens on the road, in analyzing the scene in real time, because all this, I mean, this is not fake. This is actually a recording of what the cameras actually saw and how the cameras actually interpreted the roads. And the way this is done is with convolutional neural networks. So the big breakthrough in machine learning at the moment, the technique that enjoys its time in the sun is deep learning. And these convolutional neural networks are really very similar to the way a brain analyzes a scene. So it sees this picture here, and it will analyze the scene by convolving it with a filter that runs across the screen, scanning it, and picks up certain features. The first sort of convolution will come up with lots of features like edges. So it will realize that there's a big difference between the white car here and the trees and so on. And then it does the same thing again and again, and there is a sort of max pooling stage where it throws most of the information away but only keeps the thing that is of interest. And then it repeats the whole thing a number of times. This is a sort of typical, 3, 6, 9, 12, plus 3 is a 15-layer neural network. And the output at the last layer, the fully connected layer, as it's called, is it will decide on whether what it sees in the picture here is a car, a truck, an airplane, a ship, a cyclist, or whatever. So convolutional neural networks are now so good at object recognition that they're better than humans. Any of you who have played with face recognition on Google will attest to that, and it's a breakthrough that only happened last year, where a British scientist called Jeff Hinton produced a program that really is now better at categorizing pictures than humans are. So now let's go on to how we move. Of course, this is the fight between legs and robot legs. Now we're all familiar with a human leg that looks a bit like that. And this is a robot leg. And as you see, we've got a lot more design freedom with robots. We don't need to have feet at the end of our legs in the robot world. We can have wheels. And this is the video that shows what happens if you do that. So as you see, this thing called handle can balance pretty well on wheels. It uses its hands to balance, to create a balance. It can move around bends pretty efficiently, standing up, or indeed kneeling down. And it doesn't really matter whether it's standing up or kneeling down because it's a robot. It doesn't have the restriction. It even can do a pirouette. Not quite as gracefully as a ballerina, but it can do it nevertheless. And here is something that it can do to stay stable. And here is a remarkable achievement of this robot, where if you look at the hand here, it stays constant with respect to the room, even if the thing moves. And here it picks up a weight in a way that a human can't easily, but that's, again, the design freedom that you have with a robot. It even can navigate stairs, and you will see the most remarkable thing. It goes down in the snow, and you'll see it will slip. See how it slips? And still doesn't fall over. So it catches itself. So we've really developed these robots to do amazing things. And it can even jump for joy. So, as you can see, you get surprising results if you open up the design space by using intelligent design. Oh, whoops, that's a loaded word. So, let's now look on how we learn. As I already mentioned, the biggest breakthrough on the machine side is machine learning. And the idea is that, what is machine learning? It's systems that learn from data rather than following pre-programmed rules. And there are lots of different sort of levels of machine learning. There's supervised learning, where the data is labeled. So you said, this is John, this is Mary, this is John, this is Mary. And after a while, the computer gets it. Unsupervised learning is a bit more difficult because there are no labels, but the computer still realizes that there are differences between John and Mary. So it might not know that this is John or this is Mary, but it groups the pictures into ones that look the same, and it turns out that it is actually all pictures of John And then the rest is pictures of Marys and lots of other people. Then there is a technique called reinforcement learning, which produced remarkable results, especially last year. But you need a reward function for that, and the simplest reward function, of course, is found in games, and I'll give some examples of that in a moment. And last but not least, the most complicated technique called inverse reinforcement learning works when you don't even have a reward function, where it tries to work out the reward function itself. And driving a car, of course, is a good example, because if the reward function in driving a car would be to get from A to B the fastest, this would not be a very good optimization problem to solve, because the thing would career off, of course, irrespective of how many other cars or pedestrians it hits on the way. So you also now have to give it the objective of avoiding cars and avoiding pedestrians and keeping in your lane. But that's not enough either. You've got to respect the traffic rules. So there are lots and lots of constraints that it has got to work out on. That's why this is a difficult problem. Now, speech recognition, I've already shown you, is very important with all smartphones now having very good, in fact, amazingly good speech recognition. OK Google or Hey Siri is what I'm sure lots of you use on your smartphones. And let's have another go at Echo here. Alexa, who is going to win the British elections?
I can't see the future.
That's a better answer. And it can deal with fairly complex questions as well. Alexa, who was president of the United States when Obama was a teenager?
Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon, Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford were the US presidents when Barack Obama was a teenager.
So as you can see, this was actually quite a tricky question, because the first thing you had to do is work out what a teenager is. Well, a teenager is a teenager only between 13 and 20, so there are only 7 years. So how can you have 4 presidents in 7 years? So I thought it got it wrong until I actually checked myself, and as it turns out, Nixon resigned 5 days after Obama turned 13, so that's one. Gerald Ford only served out the Nixon term, so that's 2 years. Jimmy Carter was only a one-term president, so that's 4 years, that's 6 years, and then Ronald Reagan was the 4th. So as you can see, some quite complex things can now already be solved by computers. Now, if there is one slide I want you to remember from this presentation, it's this one. It's the probability rules. The most basic and most useful concept to describe the real world is the concept of probability, and not zeros and ones. So we really have to give up the idea that things are true or false or black and white, and there's in the excluded middle. The reason why we've got this fantastic progress in machine learning all has to do with probabilities. So P is the thing to think about. Now, you've got to give up things like determinism. So things are no longer deterministic, but they never really were. So they're all statistical. But what do you gain? Well, you don't need to program any longer. You can teach. The problem with teaching is it's like teaching a child. You know, when you teach a child, it might do what you teach it, but it might decide not to. So it's not so deterministic. But the reason why this works, so the teaching in the case of computers is just to present the right training data sets. That's why data are so important. So it needs big data, and sometimes they need to be really big. Now, the big problem is with the goals, because these programs at the moment don't choose, thankfully, don't choose their own goals. At the moment, they still follow our goals. But long term, this is going to be the big problem. Will they respect human goals and our human goal structure? And I call this the genie problem, because if we were to choose the goals for the machines, we have a history of wishing for the wrong thing. We're actually very bad at choosing very high-level goals. So a few words on artificial intelligence. My neighbor Steve Hawkins in Newnham said that success in creating AI would be the biggest event in human history. Unfortunately, it might also be the last unless we learn how to avoid the risks. And Elon Musk here on the right of Tesla and SpaceX fame, the new Steve Jobs in the Valley, said, hope we're not just the biological bootloader for digital superintelligence. Unfortunately, that is increasingly probable. And here we've got early signs of such an artificial intelligence that's doing very well. It's this amazing result of AlphaGo last year in beating Lisa Dell, who was the best Go player in the world. Now, why was that such a big deal? Well, we have computer chess champions that have beaten Garry Kasparov in 1997. But why is Go so much more difficult? Well, Go is played on that 19 by 19 board on the intersections, as you see with these stones, that never move. You just put them down once. But the number of configurations here is bigger than the number of atoms in the universe. This is an incredibly complex game. And indeed, it is so complex that it has defied every programmer in the world to write a program that gets anywhere near a reasonable human level, a human Go player. Until Demis Hassabis of DeepMind came along and said, well, I'm not going to program this. I'm going to use deep learning methods to train it by watching lots of games. So it watched lots of games, it got sort of plausibly competent, but then what computers can do, of course, that humans can't, it then played 30 million games against itself. And every time I played against itself and realized, well, I won this one against myself, what did I do? That was a good idea. And it just stored that away and improved every time. So they then produced this challenge, challenged Lisa Dahl in Korea in March 2016. And then came move 37 in game 2, which was a move made by AlphaGo, the computer. This was such an outrageous move that Lee got up for 15 minutes and walked around and couldn't make up his mind whether this was a bug in the computer, and the computer was just being stupid, or the computer just played a genius move. As it turned out, it was the latter, and it was that move that won the game for the machine. This move had such an impact on the Go community, and there are about 40 million Go players in the world. It's mainly played in Asia, and it's one of the oldest games in the world. And they have eons in the Go history that are named after moves. And this was such an outstanding move that when it was analyzed afterwards, it was only the chance of this move being made was 1 in 10,000 that a human would make a move like that. So people got very excited about this achievement of a computer. And then came move 78 in game 4, which was a move played by Lisa Dahl, which was equally brilliant. And when they analyzed this move, it was also a move that a human would only play once every 10,000 times. So there is hope for us yet. Short history of AI starts with Aristotle, of course, and its syllogism that I've already mentioned. Then Alan Turing in 1950, in a very famous paper, asked the questions, can computer think? And came up with the Turing test. The Dartmouth College meeting in 1956 coined the phrase artificial intelligence. There was a lot of excitement then for quite a while until the Lighthill report. One of our great professors here rightly pointed out that this excitement was really still unfounded and started the AI winter because the support and funding for AI dried up. Then there was a revival with expert systems that were actually based on this digital, on the first order predicate calculus, and there was a lot of excitement about that until people realized that first order predicate calculus isn't actually a very good way of describing the real world. At the same time, Japan started the 5th generation project, which again was a very exciting time. I used to travel to Japan during those days. to participate in some of the conferences. But then in 1987, we had the second AI winter because, again, the results didn't come in. However, since the year 2000, there has been a constant stream of amazing results based on convolutional neural networks and deep learning. And this is causing a lot of disruption. We've just seen this disruption with ARM, of course, and the business model, a disruption that ARM brought about. I mean, how can a little Cambridge company beat Intel at its main game? And the answer was because of the different business model. Taking it from the bottom up, both Intel and ARM have the intellectual property. Both Intel and ARM design the microprocessors, but here comes the big difference. Intel also then fabricates the microprocessors and sells it in the PC business to companies like Dell and HP. In the smartphone business, ARM licenses companies like TSMC and 450 others because people in the smartphone business just do not buy microprocessors. So if you're Intel and your job is to sell microprocessors and there is no market for microprocessors, then you've got a problem. Well, we got lucky here that we had the right business model. We licensed microprocessors, and that's what people wanted. So we could set a standard with no less than 450 producers, semiconductor companies in the world to completely dominate the business for microprocessors in smartphones. So Apple and Samsung all produce microprocessors to our design. And the design is called the ARM Cortex design. And here is the result. We've now shipped over 100 billion ARMs in the world. This is 10 times the number of people on Earth. So all of you have, on average, have rather more than 10 ARMs on you. And you might ask, well, where are mine? And the answer is that if you have a smartphone in your pocket, you're likely to have 20 ARMs in your pocket because it's not just the main processor, it's the processor in the USB, the Wi-Fi, the Bluetooth, and lots of other functions that are now better solved by little processors in your phone than by hardware. As was already mentioned earlier, it was sold for $30 billion to SoftBank. We are outselling Intel at the ratio of 20-1 at the moment. It's a totally amazing number. But it's not just the number, it's also the value. So since 2010, the value of the ARM sales in the world through our 450 licensees has exceeded Intel revenue since 2010 because of the licensing model, and of course because Intel never figured out how to produce such a low-power chip as ours. Now, we'll see a similar thing in the car industry. At the moment, the customer goes into a showroom and makes a sort of £20,000 decision based on the price, the power, the horsepower, the mileage that you get on the car, the looks of the car, the color, etc. In the future, and I see this already with my son, people make a £10 decision between the time that they get up from their seats in the restaurant and the exit, and they decide whether tonight they're going to take an Uber car, a Get Taxi, or a Halo, or a Lyft, which completely changes the relationship between the suppliers and the consumers. So BMW has no relationship with the customer anymore. The relationship is with Uber. Now, if Uber also produces autonomous software, it really gets very dangerous for companies like BMW, because Uber is going to say, okay, I want to buy 10,000 cars, make me a price. And I want 3 cameras there, 1 radar there, and this is the specification of my car. And if BMW doesn't sell them the car at the right specification, they go to BYD, the largest battery manufacturer in the world, and now also the largest electric car manufacturer in China, or Kia in Korea. So this is a very dangerous restructuring of the complete car industry, as indeed we have seen in the computer industry 6 times already. Some of you might have been to another talk that I give called The 6 Waves of Computing, where the people who dominate one wave always miss the next one. I thought that was peculiar to the industry. I now believe that this is happening in all sectors. It just happens at different times. And the car industry is in for such a major disruption. The last thing I want to talk about is the only $1 trillion opportunity that I know, which is healthcare. If you look at the US spends $3 trillion on healthcare, 70% of which is spent on treating people who are ill, and only 30% is spent on keeping them healthy. And I think that will change to a ratio of 50-50 over the next 5 years, and that's a shift of $1 trillion. And here is the reason why. At the moment, it's all based on drugs and treating patients. And it's the pharma companies that produce the drugs, and they sell it to the doctors, the hospital, and then the patient gets the drug. If you believe that actually the shift will be to keeping people healthy, then the most important component to this value stack here is data. I really need to know about the particular person that I'm trying to keep healthy. I will soon know everybody's genome. You will know their lifestyle because there are lots of watches and sensors that people run around with that will give me a good characterization of the health vector that people have. It will all be about e-health, and it's all about healthy person, and the people that are buying that information, we don't buy them from doctors or from hospitals, we buy them over the internet. So here I come to my last slide, which is really evolution versus design. You all know about Darwin's theory of natural selection, but this will come to an end because we have an automated way of producing models in the world, which started with Aristotle's syllogism. Then came Thomas Bayes' brilliant idea that probability is really the right way of characterizing the real world. Then we had Alan Turing telling us what can be computed and what can't. But the new guy on the block is not a human, but it is an intelligent machine. So I'll leave you with the following conclusion, that humanity really has a new partner. And these new partners are called intelligent machines. And our big problem for the next generation is how to co-evolve with these intelligent machines to make sure that we continue to have a reasonable place on this planet going forward. Thank you very much.